The room was silent, not the silence of peace, but the kind that came before catastrophe, the kind that weighed heavy in the chests of those who sat within the towering halls of the Galactic Concord, an assembly of the most advanced civilizations in the known universe. The Council Chamber, an ancient construct of obsidian and gold, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. It had heard the desperate pleas of dying civilizations and the cold, calculated declarations of conquerors. But in all its long history, it had never witnessed something quite like this. A single screen hovered in the void above the central podium, casting an eerie glow upon the gathered representatives. On that screen, a battle raged, or rather, a massacre. At first, the Council had dismissed it as another futile struggle, a primitive species fighting against the inevitable. The Zelvari Dominion, a warlike empire that thrived on planetary subjugation, had engaged in their latest conquest. Their fleet, black as the void, had descended upon a human colony world known as Varkos 7, expecting a swift and effortless occupation. That expectation was shattered within the first hour. The footage playing before the Council was raw, pulled directly from the Zelvari warships before their signals had gone dark. It was supposed to show overwhelming victory, the crushing power of a superior force. Instead, the Council watched as the humans turned the war into something else entirely. A Zelvari warlord, his bioluminescent tendrils twitching with discomfort, leaned forward. "Pause the recording." The screen froze mid-frame. A single human stood in the wreckage of a battlefield, surrounded by the torn husks of Zelvari warriors. His armor was cracked, his weapon running low on charge. Smoke curled around him, and yet he was smiling. A slow, predatory grin. That's when the Council realized the battle was far from over. The silence in the Galactic Concord chamber stretched, suffocating as the frozen image of the human remained on the screen. No one spoke. No one dared to. High Chancellor Vorash, an elder of the Athari species, finally broke the quiet. His translucent, gelatinous form quivered under the weight of a realization he refused to voice. "Resume the footage." The recording flickered. Back to life. The Zelvari forces should have won. Their war machines were unmatched, their weapons capable of vaporizing entire platoons in a single volley. But the humans fought differently. They did not rely on formations, did not obey the predictable logic of most civilizations. The Council watched as the lone human, his name still unknown, moved through the battlefield like a ghost of war. He didn't just fight the Zelvari, he hunted them. His movements were erratic, unpredictable, as if he thrived in the chaos. He turned wreckage into cover, fallen enemies into weapons. His rifle had long since run out of plasma rounds, but that didn't stop him. He used the blade of a fallen Zelvari to cut his way through their ranks. The Dominion had expected a battle of strength. Instead, they had walked into something primal, a war of adaptation. The footage ended abruptly, static swallowing the final moments as the Zelvari command ship's transmission ceased. A weighted pause followed. Then a voice rasped through the chamber. "What are we watching?" It was Admiral Skelos of the Drexy Imperium, a species renowned for their brutal efficiency in warfare. Even he, a veteran of thousands of campaigns, had leaned forward in his seat, his razor-sharp mandibles clicking in unease. A deep, mechanical hum filled the chamber as Archminister Valon of the Zorkai Collective, a machine intelligence species, processed the data in real time. Probability of human victory against Zelvari ground forces, 87%. Gasps rippled through the assembly. That was impossible. The Zelvari should have had a 97% advantage. And yet, the Dominion forces were gone. A representative from the Vroth Confederacy, their avian features twitching with anxiety, spoke next. This was not an organized military. This was one human. Silence. Then a cold, amused chuckle. All heads turned toward a figure who had remained quiet until now. Seated in the corner, shrouded in shadow, was the human ambassador. Ambassador Rains. He had been there the entire time, watching, listening. His presence had been dismissed at the beginning of the meeting. After all, what was a human voice against the weight of the Concord? Now, the entire chamber stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Ambassador Rains leaned forward, tapping a single finger against the armrest of his seat. His voice was calm, too calm. "Gentlemen," he said, "you misunderstand something fundamental about my kind." The pause stretched, suffocating. "You thought that was a battle. Another beat. That was just a warm-up." The chamber erupted. Not in shouts, no. This was something far worse. A suffocating wave of silence, thick with unspoken terror and dawning realization, rolled through the council. Delegates shifted uncomfortably, some tapping feverishly at their hollow screens, demanding second opinions, recalculations, anything to contradict the data they had just witnessed. There was no contradiction. The Zelvari Dominion had not simply lost an engagement, they had lost control. High Chancellor Varash's voice cut through the unease like a blade. "Human," he addressed Ambassador Rains directly, his gelatinous mass pulsating under the strain of emotions his kind rarely expressed. "You will explain." Rains exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, before tilting his head at the frozen screen, where the human warrior's smile still lingered like an omen. He spoke with the ease of a man discussing the weather, not a battlefield littered with corpses. "What you just saw," he gestured lazily at the display, "is one of ours, a man trained by nothing more than war, sent to the far reaches of the galaxy to do what humans do best, survive, adapt, overcome." The phrasing sent a ripple of unease through the council. Ambassador Rains leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the grand table as he interlaced his fingers. "And you think that was impressive?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "That was one man." The Zorkai Archminister let out a low, synthetic hum. "You are suggesting humans can replicate this performance at scale?" "Suggesting?" Rains chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I'm informing you." Another wave of silence, then a new voice, icy and venomous. "Then they should be exterminated before they become a greater threat." All eyes turned toward War Prince Korix of the Zelvari Dominion. Unlike the others, he had remained still throughout the presentation, not out of shock but calculating rage. He had seen his forces crushed, his elite warriors butchered, and now, with all eyes on him, his bioluminescent tendrils flared in barely contained fury. "The Concord must act," Korix continued, his tone smooth yet dangerous. "Humanity is a disease, one that, if left unchecked, will spread beyond control." The implication was clear. Extermination. A cold chill swept through the council chamber. Even those who despised humanity hesitated at such a declaration. Genocide was not a word to be thrown lightly, not even in the halls of power. But Rains, he smirked. It was subtle, but it was there, just enough to make Korix's mandibles twitch in irritation. "You're welcome to try," Rains said, his voice dangerously calm. "But if you think humans will die quietly—" He let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "You haven't been paying attention." Korix slammed a fist on the table, but before he could bark another threat, a soft beep interrupted him. A new hollow transmission blinked into existence in the center of the chamber. Live footage. Rains's smirk grew. "Well," he murmured, sitting, back, arms folded. "Looks like you're already too late." The video feed displayed the Zelvari home fleet, their pride, their strongest line of defense. Hundreds of black warships, a force that had never been broken until now. One by one, the ships vanished in brilliant bursts of light. Human warships had arrived. The Zelvari home fleet was burning. Across the Galactic Concord chamber, council members, watched in stunned silence as their displays streamed real-time footage of the impossible. The Zelvari Dominion's grand fleet, unbreakable, the hammer of conquest that had shattered 100 worlds, was being torn apart before their very eyes. One by one, their warships vanished in bursts of white-hot explosions. Some detonated from within, their reactors overloaded by pinpoint strikes. Others were carved apart, their hulls sheared through by kinetic slugs traveling at relativistic speeds. There was no sound in space, but the images carried a violence that needed no audio. The humans had arrived. On the bridge of the ISS Retribution, Admiral Elias Carter stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the unfolding battle with cold precision. His uniform, jet black and unadorned save for the insignia of Terran High Command, made him seem more like a shadow than a man. A junior officer spoke hesitantly. "Sir, Zelvari reinforcements are scrambling. Defense grids are activating." Carter nodded once, his expression unreadable. "They'll adapt. They always do." His next words, however, came like an executioner's decree. But not fast enough. The order was given, and hell followed. The human fleet moved differently from anything the Concorde had seen before. They did not adhere to the rigid formations of traditional space warfare, nor did they rely on sheer numbers like the Zelvari. Instead, they hunted. Stealth cruisers flickered, in and out of sensor range, their positions shifting unpredictably. Orbital bombardment strikes came from angles the Zelvari hadn't even considered vulnerable. High-speed torpedoes ripped through command ships, their payloads burrowing deep before detonating antimatter charges in the heart of their reactors. For every human warship that was lost, 10 Zelvari ships followed. The War Prince's own flagship, the behemoth Dominion's Wrath, took a direct hit amidships. The explosion rippled across its hull, splitting it like rotting fruit. Fragments of its once mighty frame tumbled toward the gas giant below, burning like dying embers in the void. And for the first time in thousands of years, the Zelvari were losing. Inside the Concorde chamber, War Prince Corix's mandibles trembled. His bioluminescent tendrils dimmed, the bright green of authority now a sickly shade of shock. He had not spoken since the battle began streaming. None of them had. The reality had crashed upon them like a tidal wave. The Zelvari were the most ruthless warriors the Concorde had ever known. Their conquests were legend, their fleets a symphony of dominance, and yet here they were, being dismantled. They knew. The words were a whisper, but they cut through the chamber like a blade. All eyes turned to Ambassador Rains. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He merely sat there watching. The realization set in. Humanity had planned this. The Zelvari's invasion of Varkos 7 had not been an accident. It had not been a test of survival. It had been bait, and the Dominion had walked straight into it. Chancellor Vurash, his gelatinous form quivering, finally understood. "You knew they would retaliate." Rains slowly exhaled. "Of course we did." The room felt smaller, heavier. The air itself seemed denser. This was not a species fighting for survival. This was a species at war, not just with the Zelvari, with all of them. The war was no longer coming. It had already begun. Inside the Galactic Conquered chamber, the once mighty War Prince Corix slumped in his seat, his mandibles slack. His home fleet, his pride, his legacy, was gone. The Zelvari Dominion had never known defeat. They had only ever conquered. Now, their most secure stronghold had been reduced to wreckage in a single engagement, and the humans had barely broken a sweat. The council chamber, a place where empires had bargained for survival and alliances had been forged in whispers, was suffocatingly silent. No one dared to speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood. This wasn't just a human retaliation. It wasn't even a declaration of war. It was a demonstration, a warning, and it had come too late. On the bridge of the ISS Retribution, Admiral Elias Carter studied the tactical readouts with the calm of a man reviewing paperwork. not overseeing. The annihilation of an Empire's war fleet, final damage report. He asked, his voice even. A sensor officer turned from her station. 72% of Zelvari ships destroyed or disabled beyond recovery. Their orbital defenses are down, and planetary command is in full retreat. Carter gave a slow nod. And our casualties? Minimal. For a long moment, Carter said nothing. He simply watched the burning debris drifting into the gravity well of the Zelvari homeworld. The Dominion had believed itself invincible. Now its fleets were nothing more than wreckage. "Send the message," Carter said. The comms officer hesitated. "Sir, the Council will see this as—" "They'll see what they need to see." Carter turned his gaze to the endless black of space beyond the viewport. Cold, unforgiving, unbound. "Send it." The order went out, and within seconds, across the stars, a simple transmission reached every major galactic power. Inside the conquered chamber, every holoscreen blinked to life simultaneously. Every diplomat, every official, every high-ranking officer in the room turned as a single phrase flashed across their screens, encoded in every known language. A simple, brutal message. "We are humanity. We do not forgive. We do not forget. And we are coming." No one spoke, no one breathed. For the first time in recorded history, the rulers of the galaxy knew fear. The message had spread. It was a whisper in the halls of power, a scream in the void, a reckoning in the hearts of those who once believed. The galaxy belonged to them, and now the fear was setting in. Inside the Galactic Concord chamber, Chancellor Varash sat motionless, his gelatinous form shifting in slow, uneasy waves. The words on the holoscreen still burned in his mind. "We are humanity. We do not forgive. We do not forget. And we are coming." He turned his many eyes toward the rest of the council. None of them spoke. Some stared blankly at the transmission, as if by refusing to blink, they could deny its reality. Others trembled, whispering furiously into their comlinks, issuing emergency orders to their homeworlds. And then there was War Prince Corix. His bioluminescent tendrils were still, unmoving, not in thought, in horror. His empire was shattered. His people, once the predators of the stars, had become the hunted. Finally he spoke, his voice raw with something the Zelvari had never known before. "What have we done?" No one answered, because they all knew the truth. They had doomed themselves. Beyond the council walls, the galaxy was already shifting. The Drexy Imperium, once proud warriors, had ordered a full-scale withdrawal from all contested territories. They had survived thousands of wars, but they had never fought against something that hunted for the sake of the hunt. The Vroth Confederacy had gone silent. Their fleets, usually seen enforcing diplomatic treaties, had vanished into deep space as if hoping to escape the inevitable. The Zorkai collective, cold and calculating, had begun rerouting resources toward weapons research at an unprecedented scale. Their AI models suggested one undeniable outcome: survival required adaptation, and the Zelvari Dominion, their borders were collapsing. Entire colonies were surrendering without a fight, because if the humans could do that to their strongest fleet, there was no hope for their worlds. In the void, at the edge of known space, a single Terran warship drifted. Inside, Ambassador Rains stood in silence, watching, waiting. The transmission had gone out. The message had been received. The galaxy thought it knew war. It didn't, not yet. And deep within the heart of human space, where countless warships were being built, where soldiers trained in ways the Concord couldn't fathom, where humanity's true strength remained hidden, a single thought echoed: "They started this war. We will end it on our terms." The war had not yet begun. Not truly, but the galaxy was already breaking. Inside the Galactic Concord chamber, the silence had settled into something heavier, not just fear, but realization. The realization that they were no longer in control. For millennia, the Concord had played kingmaker, deciding which civilizations thrived, which were allowed to expand, which would be broken before they became a problem. Humanity had shattered that balance in a single moment. High Chancellor Vorash, his gelatinous form pulsing under the weight of the crisis, turned to the gathered council members. His voice was measured, but beneath it lurked something rare for his kind: desperation. We must act. The Drexy Imperium delegate, his chitinous fingers twitching against the armrest of his seat, let out a low click. Act? How? The humans have made it clear. This isn't a war we can win. Then we must consider... Vorash hesitated, tasting the words before he dared to speak them. Diplomacy. The word landed like an impact tremor. A dozen voices rose at once, half in outrage, half in barely contained panic. Diplomacy. The Vroth representative's feathers ruffled in disgust. With what? A species that just broadcasted their intent to burn the galaxy down? You saw what they did to the Zelvari. They do not negotiate. Across the chamber, War Prince Korix stirred. His once proud form seemed smaller now, diminished. They will come for us all, he murmured, more to himself than the others. Not just the Zelvari. This is not a war for conquest. It is a hunt. The chamber fell silent again, because they all knew he was right. This wasn't about territory. It wasn't about resources. The humans weren't fighting for domination. They were fighting for a message that had already been received, and no empire, no fleet, no treaty in the known galaxy could unsend it. Meanwhile, deep in the void, a meeting was taking place. Not in a grand council chamber, not on a homeworld, but aboard a single human warship, drifting just outside known space. Inside a darkened room, Ambassador Rains stood before the gathered commanders of the Terran. A command. On the holoscreen before them, data scrolled in real time. Zelvari positions collapsing. Drexy fleets repositioning. Concord forces in disarray. The galaxy was panicking. Just as they had planned, Rains exhaled, then turned to Admiral Carter, who stood with his arms crossed, watching the unfolding chaos with quiet satisfaction. Now, Rains said, his voice calm, measured. We see who wants to negotiate. A pause. Then Carter gave a slow nod. And who wants to die? The Galactic Concord was crumbling. Not in the way civilizations fall under the weight of war. Not yet. But something far worse. Doubt. And doubt spreads faster than any war fleet. Inside the Grand Council chamber, the argument had reached a fever pitch. The factions that had ruled the stars for thousands of years now stood divided, their once unified voices fractured into chaos. The humans must be stopped now. The Vroth representative screeched, his talons scraping against the polished floor. Every moment we hesitate is another moment they prepare. A Drexy warlord hissed in frustration, mandibles snapping. And how do you suggest we do that? You saw what they did to the Zelvari. Even if we gathered every fleet in the Concord, do you truly believe we would fare better? They are not invincible, a Zorkai machine leader intoned, its synthetic voice devoid of emotion. Probability of human vulnerabilities is statistically inevitable. We simply have not yet identified the correct pressure points. Then we find them, another delegate growled, and we strike before it is too late. High Chancellor Vorash, the oldest among them, let out a slow, measured exhale. It is already too late. Silence fell. Not the uneasy, frantic silence of indecision, but the heavy, suffocating silence of realization. The humans had won. Not by force, Not yet, but by something far worse, by fear, by forcing the Concorde to look upon itself and see, for the first time, the fractures in its own foundation. And like all things that break under pressure, it would soon collapse. Elsewhere, deep in uncharted space. Inside the command center of Terran High Command, Ambassador Rains and Admiral Carter stood before a sprawling holographic display of the known galaxy. Every faction, every fleet, every political fault line they had just exposed. "This is it," Rains said, his voice calm, measured. Carter gave a slow nod, arms folded behind his back. "They're turning on each other." "Of course they are." Rains let out a quiet chuckle. They were never truly united. The only reason the Concorde existed was because no one ever challenged their rule. Until now. His gaze flickered to the readouts. The Drexy Imperium was on the verge of withdrawing. The Vroth Confederacy was already planning preemptive strikes against their own allies. The Concorde wasn't preparing for war against humanity. They were preparing for war against themselves. Carter studied the display for a long moment. Then finally, he spoke. "Begin Phase 2. Rains turned, an eyebrow raised. "Are you sure? We could let them tear each other apart for a few more cycles." Carter's expression was unreadable. "We could." A pause. Then his lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "But we came here to win." His next words sealed the fate of the galaxy. "Deploy the Second Fleet." The Second Fleet had been deployed, and the galaxy was running out of time. It began with a whisper, a missing patrol here, a blacked-out comms relay there, small, almost imperceptible disturbances that, on their own, meant nothing. But together, they spelled one undeniable truth. The humans were moving, and this time they were not just attacking, they were erasing. Inside the Drexy Imperium's high war chamber, Supreme Commander Vakrox stared at the holomap with narrowed eyes. His mandibles clicked in irritation. "They're hitting supply lines," he growled. "Not just ours, everyone's." His second-in-command, a veteran of more battles than most species could count, let out a low hiss. "They're not preparing for a war. They're preparing to end one before it begins." Vakrox's clawed fingers flexed against the war table. He had spent his life as a warrior, leading the Imperium through glorious conquests, crushing resistance before it could take root. And yet, in all his years, he had never seen anything like this. The humans did not fight for honor. They did not fight for territory. They fought to win, and they were damn good at it. "We must act before they dismantle the entire war effort," one of his officers snapped. "If we wait any longer..." An alert blared through the chamber. Every screen in the room flickered. The holoprojectors shifted, displaying something that made every Drexy in the room freeze. It was a transmission. Not from the humans, from the Vroth Confederacy. The message was simple, spoken in the clipped, formal dialect of the avian species. "We are no longer allies." Then the weapons locked on, and the first civil war in the history of the Galactic Concorde began. Meanwhile, in the void aboard the ISS Nemesis, Admiral Elias Carter stood at the center of a bridge bathed in the cold blue glow of tactical readouts. The plan had worked. The Concorde was crumbling. The Drexy and Vroth were turning on each other. The Zelvari were barely holding on to their remaining systems. The Zorkai were calculating their odds and realizing their only path to survival was submission or annihilation. Humanity had turned the galaxy's greatest strength, its size, its alliances, its politics, into its greatest weakness. And now it was time to finish what had been started. Carter's gaze flickered toward the holomap, where dozens of human fleets moved into strike positions across multiple systems. Ambassador Rains stood at his side, arms crossed. "They'll never recover from this." Carter nodded once. That's the point. A single command sealed the fate of an empire. Begin planetary operations. And across the stars, human boots touched down on enemy soil. For the first time in history, humanity was not the hunted. They were the ones coming for blood. The first boots hit the ground, and the galaxy would never be the same. Across the former territories of the Galactic Concord, the humans landed in force. Not like conquerors, not like invaders, like executioners. They struck where it mattered, not sprawling metropolises or military fortresses, but the nerve centers of each faction's infrastructure, planetary defense command centers, energy relays, orbital shipyards, the organs of war, and they cut them out. On the burning world of Juris 9, once a proud Drexy stronghold, Supreme Commander Vakrox had only minutes to process the fall of his empire. The last transmission from his war council had come through garbled, half-lost in a storm of static and failing encryption. The Vroth betrayed us. Zorkai fleets withdrawing. They're already here. And then silence. Vakrox's mandibles clenched as he stared at the ruined skyline of his homeworld, flames licking at the remains of his once unbreakable defenses. His officers were dead, his fleets were shattered, and the humans, they were walking through the wreckage like they had always belonged there. Dark armor, faceless visors, precision in every movement, no wasted energy, no hesitation. They advanced like inevitability itself. A lone human soldier paused in the rubble, glancing toward Vakrox's crumbling command bunker. Their head tilted slightly, and for a moment, just one moment, Vakrox thought he saw it, the smile, that damnable, predatory smile. And then the bombs dropped. Juris 9 ceased to exist. In the depths of space, aboard the ISS Nemesis, Admiral Carter watched the readouts flicker. One by one, enemy strongholds were vanishing. Reins exhaled beside him, arms folded. And just like that, the war is over. Carter didn't reply immediately. His eyes remained on the tactical display, where the last remnants of the Concorde were either surrendering or running. Not that there was anywhere left to run. He finally spoke, his voice even. "No, not yet." Reins arched an eyebrow. "No?" Carter's gaze turned to the final system still lit up in red, the conquered capital, the last bastion of the old order. "They need to understand," Carter murmured. Completely. A moment of silence then set course for the conquered homeworld, and with that the final battle began. The last stronghold of the conquered stood alone, a lone world against an inevitable tide, and the humans were coming. The planet. Velthir Prime had once been the beating heart of the Galactic Concord, a world of towering citadels, sprawling diplomatic embassies, and the endless hum of politics that had kept the galaxy in balance for millennia. Now, it was a graveyard in waiting. Above the planet, the final remnants of the Concorde's fleet. What little remained of its once mighty war machine held formation, their weapons locked, primed and trembling, not out of readiness, out of fear, because before them, like the closing jaws of an unstoppable beast, hung the full force of the Terran fleet, the second and third human armada, more ships than the Concorde, had believed humanity even possessed, more firepower than had ever been concentrated in one place, and they were waiting, not attacking, waiting. Inside the Concorde's last war room, High Chancellor Varash stood before the flickering holo display. Watching the cold, silent blockade above his world, the humans had every advantage, every reason to finish this, and yet they had not fired. Not yet. The chamber was filled with whispers, desperate orders, fragmented thoughts. The Drexy were gone. The Zelvari were gone. The Vroth had turned against them. The Zorkai had fled into deep space, waiting to see which way the wind blew. The conquered was alone, and still the humans waited. Not speaking, not negotiating, just waiting. like predators in the dark. A transmission came through, one single encrypted frequency. Vorash hesitated. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he accepted the call. The chamber dimmed as a single figure appeared in holographic light. Not a warlord, not an emperor. A man, Ambassador Rains, stood with his hands behind his back, expression unreadable. His presence, alone and unarmored, made the moment all the more terrifying. "Chancellor," Rains said, voice calm, patient. "It's over." The words hung there, heavy, final. Vorash's gelatinous form pulsed in slow, unsteady waves. He already knew, but he still had to ask. "And if we surrender?" Rains exhaled through his nose. "That depends." Vorash's limbs tightened. "On what?" A pause. Then Rains tilted his head ever so slightly. "On whether or not you still believe you're in a position to negotiate." The words were not cruel, not angry, just true. Vorash's limbs shook. He looked away from the hologram, glancing around the chamber, his advisors, his generals. He had built this empire on certainty, and now there was none. Just silence. Slowly his gaze returned to Rains, and he nodded, a single, slow nod. The war was over. Above Velthir Prime, the human fleet did not fire. There was no final bombardment, no last, petty destruction. Because humanity did not need to reduce the conquered's homeworld to rubble. The galaxy already knew the truth. The age of the conquered was over, and the age of humanity had begun.